Hey everybody, it's Michael here. Today what I wanted to do is do a book analysis of a recent book that I read. It's called Posthistoric Man. It's a really interesting book. It's a great title, and the topic of this book is really what we do with technology and how human beings are progressing on this continuum of constantly advancing technology. What does this mean for our future? What does this mean about how we can look back into the past? So it's a really interesting book that wrestles with a lot of the issues that I like to wrestle with and like to read a lot of a lot of thinkers wrestle with this idea. So it's a very timely book. It was written in 1950, ages ago, but it still has a semblance of modernism to it. It has a semblance of futurism where you can pick this book up today and take away the same arguments. Everything holds true of what Roderick Seidenberg, the author, was talking about 75 years ago. Well, many of those same things are still true. I think all of those things are still true today. So, as I said, it's a really fascinating book, and I love the topic of it. What I'll do first is I'll go through and just kind of tell you who Roderick Seidenberg is, and then we'll jump into the meat and potatoes of the book, talk about the main thesis, some of his key arguments, and so on and so forth. So, first, let's just jump into it. Roderick Seidenberg was a New York City architect working in the early half of the 20th century. And I love that as his biography because when you think about technologists, when you think about somebody like uh, Lewis Mumford, who Seidenberg was actually a friend of, or you think of Fuller, or you think of some of these other folks, they tend to have either a philosophical bent to them. They were trained in philosophy, they were trained in anthropology or history, or they come from some technical class, right? They're a technician, they're an engineer, they're a mechanic. But what I like about Seidenberg is that he's actually an architect, so he's approaching this from kind of a different angle, but he's still observing, he's still noticing some of the same things that all these other great thinkers are noticing, which is that technology is not just shaping the way humans are, but they're shaping what we could become and what our future holds. And this is essentially the inquiry that Seidenberg puts forward for our readers, which is what is the future going to look like for human beings? And when he answers this question, he answers it by defining what history is. So that's a really interesting concept that we'll jump into. Um, Essentially, the title of the book, Posthistoric Man, is his conclusion is that eventually we are going to become post historic people in the same way that before history we were prehistoric people. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's jump into the main theme of his book. I've got my notes here. By the way, I don't know if I've shared the book title yet, but the book looks like that. I bought this. I believe this is a original 1950s copy. I did the binding on it in duct tape, and I bought it on Amazon. It said it was fair. I think it's a little bit less than fair, but nevertheless, it's a well-loved book, and I think it's really cool that I've got an original. Um, so, as I said, the central thesis of his book is that he's defining what history is in a particular way. And what he does is he juxtaposes instinct and intelligence. And in the prehistoric era, before we were making machines and before we were even using, stones and clubs and, discovering fire, we were this prehistoric man. And the prehistoric man went on for eons, right? Tens of thousands of years without any change or any development. And then essentially we start to use our intellect. Prehistoric man is an entirely instinctual being. But then, ever so slightly, we start to use our intellect. And this is the course of history. History is nothing more than tracing the amount of relative intellect we're using compared to the amount of instinct that we're using. So you think, kind of like an equation, instinct plus intellect is always going to equal 100%. Prehistoric man, it's all instinct, it's not intellect. But as history progresses, intellect becomes, or intelligence becomes, a greater proportion of that whole. And eventually, we're going to reach a crossover point where intelligence is now the dominant part of how we make decisions, and instinct is relegated to the less proportion. And then eventually, in the future, we will reach this post historic state, this post historic man, where we are not reliant on instinct at all, and that everything that we do is governed 100% by intelligence. So that's the main thesis. I think it's a really creative way to approach this question of what will we become now that we see how technology is really affecting humanity. So that is his main thesis in the book. How he gets at this is really interesting. He starts by looking at organization, and he asks the question, why does it seem like everything constantly becomes more organized? Again, he's writing in 1950. He's noticing, why are we organizing youths in the Boy Scouts? Why is that a new phenomenon that wasn't around 50 years ago? Why are we starting to organize things in like the United Nations and the League of Nations, and these intercontinental treaties? He would not have been surprised by the European Union or the IMF or the World Bank. He's noticing that there is this tendency to organize more and more. And as he sees this as a hallmark of intelligence. Intelligence loves to organize itself. It loves structure. It loves to um, have dominion of things and to decrease variation. And it loves to have stricture and predictability. And all of this comes through organization. So, one of his key points in this is that as we see greater organization, that is an indication that greater intelligence is happening in our world. Okay, so why do we care about this? Because organization is always expanding. Organization always hits a limit, and that limit is unorganized things. So that always requires more and more organization, bigger and bigger organization. So this is essentially it's at least the start of what he sees post-historic man is going to be, is one of extreme organization, one that is dominated by rules and norms rather than by instinct and individualism. And he even makes the point in architecture. Again, he himself is an architect. And he says, look, we see this huge transition from the Baroque period where everything is very ornate and individualized. And you can go to Florence and see different architecture than you could see in Germany or in England. And he says, well, what's happening in the 20th century is we have kind of this Bauhaus movement or this brutalist movement, which most people kind of see as anti art or anti expression. But what he sees it as is an expression of further organization, is that, now we're creating a standard way of building things that's expressive for the entire world, not just regionally. So it's just a way that he exemplifies this notion of organization constantly expanding, and that being a hallmark of a dominance of intelligence. Now, one of the other things that he likes to talk about is the second law of thermodynamics. He's very inspired by this. This comes up again in his conversation on historic determinism, but essentially he sees the progression of man from prehistoric man to post-historic man in the same way we should consider entropy, is that we are losing energy in the universe. This is an inevitability, and eventually there will be no more energy left in the universe. It is only a matter of time. He takes this further and he talks about crystallization and how we can have um, greater structures that are more perfect and reach a lower threshold of entropy, right? So a crystalline structure is going to, be perfected in nature because it's the perfect form and minimizes entropy loss, so on and so forth. So he takes that metaphor and he uses it a lot to say that organization, and a perfected form of organization that we're going to talk about in just a second, is really the truest form of man. And as we become more and more crystallized through organization, we're going to reach um, the future of post historic man. So, the last thing I want to mention in this topic of organization is the machine itself. So, this is a book about technology and the impact of technology on humanity. One of the things that he talks a lot about is this advent of the machine. The machine is very much the perfect organizing, the perfect crystalline structure of an organization or an organism, right? Everything in a machine works together for its given end. The form is the function. So every cog, every you know wheel, every spring is working for whatever that machine is working towards. When we see the Industrial Revolution, we see that the machine, as the perfected organism, actually immediately changes how we start to think about ourselves as people and as societies. We start to organize differently. We start to urbanize. We start to change things, and we start to make factories, right, that are oriented just like a machine. So the machine actually becomes a paradigm for how we think about society and our own social organization. So um, that is where we start with. He gets into this very interestingly through the topic of organization. I think it's a very creative way to do it. Next, I want to move into his main thesis, which, as I've already stated, is this kind of transition between a society or a humanity, really, that is totally reliant on instinct. There's no intelligence, and then the gradual development of intelligence to the point where instinct is no longer the dominant force, but intelligence is the dominant force. And then eventually, intelligence will be the only force. So he talks about kind of the slow progression of humanity, right? And how for ages and ages and ages, 20,000 years maybe, we were prehistoric man. And there was essentially no development in technology or changes in who we are. But then, ever so slightly, we see development in tools and methods of organization. We see something that Lewis Mumford might call the mega machine, where many people are organized to kind of function as a machine. And ever so slowly, we see that because we're starting to use these things like knowledge and tools and collectivism, that we are ipso facto less dependent on instinct itself. So he sees this as an inevitable phenomenon that is only moving in one direction. We're never going to go back to using less intelligence. We're only going to go and use more intelligence. Now, what this also means is that we're constantly accelerating, at least until a point where we start to run out of resources and start to run into kind of limits of our environment. Another way to think about his model of post historic man is that there is a hard limit in the universe of what we can actually innovate. Right now, there's kind of this techno optimism going around where we think we will forever reach the stars and beyond, right? And that there will be no limit to our technology. And Seidenberg thinks about this a little bit differently. He sees that the universe is finite, and however big it may be, there will be eventual a constraint in resources and technology and what we're able to accomplish, and how fast electrons move in a vacuum. So these sorts of things he recognizes as hard limits, which is ultimately going to ossify the development of technology and create the post-historic man. The post-historic man where we can no longer innovate, and we essentially become stagnant in a totally intellectually and organized society. But we'll get there in just a second. So we're progressing along our history, and that's what he defines history as, is the transition between between a dominant instinct state of affairs and a dominant intelligence state of affairs. The transition between a prehistoric man and a post-historic man. So the real kicker now is, where are we in that spectrum, and where is that crossover point? Where is that point where we see intelligence taking a much larger role, or at least a dominant role, over instinct? And as you luck would have it, we find that in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, you would think that you might get the crossover point right at the advent of the machine or at something like the scientific method. He doesn't see it that way. Instead, Seidenberg points to kind of this heroic individualism in the industrial pursuit as a key hallmark of, yes, this is where we've reached the crossover point. So he points out the people like the Henry Fords of the world, like the Andrew Carnegies and the Rockefellers. And he's saying, look, what's going on here is a technological phenomenon, and it is dominating our society. But isn't it interesting that we're ascribing the triumphs of technology and indeed organization to individuals? And this dependence on individualism is actually like our way of coping with the fact that we are no longer dominated by our instincts and by our humanity, but instead we are dominated by our organization and our technology. So he predicts that this individualism is actually going to dissipate with time. And we see that in other books of the time too. Burnham's Managerial Revolution, where he's looking that corporations are less about the individuals and more about managerialism. And that certainly has borne out to be true. So it's an interesting phenomenon. I think it's an interesting take that he doesn't put it where we might think in like the Renaissance or the Industrial Revolution or something. And I think it's an interesting take on how he integrates how we've developed the notion of the individual over the last couple centuries with our ability to reconcile the dominating role that technology has on society and on our environment. So this now gets us to our future state. If we're kind of in this accelerated period, well, we know that that acceleration is going to run out. We're going to run out of ingenuity. We're going to run into the hard limits of physics. And what that means is that organization is going to slow down, and that technological innovation is going to slow down. And eventually, that crystalline structure of the machine perfected in society, of organization, will permeate all of society. And his whole idea here is that we will lose the notion of the individual, and we will all kind of be part of one big machine. We won't even recognize that we're having this transition. Now, it's really, really interesting. In Star Trek, I'm not a Trekkie, but I'm familiar with this one adversary of the Federation of the Planets, which is the Borg. And they meet the Borg, and the Borg is a very advanced structure and civilization. And essentially, they appear very much like what Seidenberg is discussing. They kind of have a hive mind, there's no individualism, and they're very, very structured based on organization. In fact, their spaceship is a cube that rebuilds itself. So it's kind of an interesting homage, I think, to some of these ideas of a future civilization that is very, very ordered, very, very structured, without a strong individualism. So that is essentially his idea of post-historic man. He's staying away from any moralisms to this. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? He's treating it like a fundamental law of physics. This is what's going to happen. The universe is going to run out of energy. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's what's going to happen. He's taking the similar approach here. This is the path that we're on. This is what we're going to end up to. And what history is, and what we're experiencing now, is just a very minor bleep um, in the long, long progression from going from eons past of the prehistoric man and the long, long progression going forward of a very ossified post-historic man, where there is not a lot of change, just like we would see in prehistoric societies. So this kind of takes us to his third point, which is historical determinism. Now, he writes a lot about this topic in the book. I honestly wasn't too thrilled by it. I wasn't too convinced by the argumentation. But essentially, it is that this, what I've just said, is that this is going to happen and that this is an inevitability and that we can't prevent it from happening. He does a lot of metaphors with the second law of thermodynamics, where he's looking at, how these things run its course. I think it's interesting. I think in 1951, so like the year after this was published, Asimov came out with the first Foundation book, which very much, if you're not familiar with Isaac Asimov's Foundation, he looks at historic determinism. And a big part of that novel, the novel trilogy, is that we can determine what the future is going to be by looking at statistics and these sorts of things. So a very similar idea going on in the zeitgeist. I'm not saying that Asimov stole these ideas, but maybe they cross pollinated. Maybe that was going on in society. But it's an interesting tidbit as well. As I said, I wasn't too convinced by his argumentation trying to prove this one way or the other. He pulls heavily on a speech by Henry Adams in the late 19th century. Overall, not a huge thrilling or compelling part of the book. And certainly he's kind of doubling down. He's kind of reiterating what he's already said, just trying to defend that point with more precision and nuance. Um, and that kind of just takes us to the last section, which he calls vistas, visions and vistas. So he's talking about this is inevitability. What do we do with this knowledge? And very similar to what we see with the people in Asimov's Foundation, is if this is the future one way or the other, we have to determine for ourselves if we're going to accelerate in this path, slow it down, what we do with this. But overall, I applaud him for kind of staying away from the moral question a whole lot and just focusing on the mechanics of how technology is shaping society and how it's what the future might hold for humanity. Um, Overall, I liked the book a lot. I'm not exactly sure if I agree with his conclusions or not. I certainly don't think historic determinism is had a whole lot of merit to it, but I thought the book was really, really interesting. I thought the way he approached uh, a topic, a question that many, many people have. I think he approached it in a very, very creative way. I love the way he starts by looking at organization. And I'm reading the first chapter going, I'm not really sure where he's going with this, but he brings it together beautifully. And I think it's a really, if not compelling, a really elegant story of what we're doing with technology and where we're going as a society. So if you like the book, again, it's called, if you like this review, this analysis, it's called Posthistoric Man. And I think it's a creative way to start thinking about um, our own relationship with technology, with innovation, and with organization as well.